Well, let's talk about that Alaska summit. For that, we're joined by Dr. H A Hellyer, Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute for Defence. Dr. Hellyer, a warm welcome. First, this is, the first face-to-face meeting between a U.S. president and Putin since 2021. What message does Trump send by, saying, hey, let's meet, but in this instance with Putin without Volodymyr Zelensky?
Thank you for having me on the program. I don't think it sends a good message at all. President Putin is an indicted criminal under the ICC, the International Criminal Court. President Trump has invited him to the United States and has not brought the president of the country that President Putin actually occupies in Ukraine. And there have been suggestions in the media over the last couple of days that quote-unquote, a solution for Ukraine would be a West Bank-style occupation of eastern Ukraine, which I think says a lot about how we've utterly dehumanized and underrated how horrible the occupation of the West Bank actually is under Israeli control, where they make the lives of Palestinians absolutely horrendous. So I don't think that this is particularly great news. We wait to see what sort of outcomes will come out of it. Putin is trying to win Trump over to Russia's side, something that I think would have been unthinkable under pretty much any other president in recent American history. And I think it's telling that Putin thinks that he can actually get somewhere in that regard with regards to President Trump.
Well, that remains to be seen, but the White House has called the summit an important listening exercise. I suppose that's one of the things they'll be listening out for. The Kremlin says, on the other hand, that conflict and settlement and international security will indeed be discussed. So we know this based on what we know on the table. Do you think it can at least nudge in the right direction? Because this is probably one of many meetings.
So again, the framing of this is just very problematic. The main issue that divides the United States from Russia is its occupation of Ukraine. And not having Zelensky even around in this meeting it sends a very poor message to Europe. It sends a very poor message, of course, to Ukraine in particular, and it frankly emboldens and encourages President Putin at a time when you want to push back against the sense of impunity and increase the sense of accountability. But we're not seeing that through this meeting.
Yeah, you talked about Putin trying to influence Trump. Well, we do know that Russia is interested in economic cooperation and airspace rights with the U.S. Perhaps, do you see that as a tool that Trump could leverage to extract some real security guarantees for Ukraine?
So I think that the issue when it comes to Ukraine and the United States over the last few years is that, especially under Trump, the United States has leverage, and the United States does have the ability to push Russia to the negotiation table seriously. But especially in the past 9 to 12 months, we've seen a real lack of political will in that regard, where you've seen very open dispute and discomfort between the Americans and the Ukrainians, especially earlier this year, that rather now infamous meeting between Zelensky and Trump in the White House and the Oval Office. So I don't think that this is a great way to continue that. It gives the impression that Ukraine is not allied to the United States and the United States doesn't stand firmly behind Ukraine. On the contrary, it positions the United States as being somehow equidistant between the Ukrainians and the Russians, which doesn't really help the Ukrainians. It doesn't help European security. And it frankly doesn't help the idea that the rules-based order even exists anymore when you're inviting and hosting somebody who's been indicted by the ICC. Having said that, they've also hosted Netanyahu in the White House a number of times, and his country is in the dock for genocide. So maybe it's
Trump has
quite so bad.
vowed that he will not be negotiating away any Ukrainian territory without Kyiv's consent, at least for this meeting. So if the talks do not result in any ceasefire, he's also said that pressure will come to bear. What does that pressure look like? Is it a particular sanction that might work better, or a combination of penalties that you feel that might change Moscow's cost-benefit calculus?
So the answer is I don't know, and I don't think anybody does, because Trump has been particularly erratic when it comes to Ukraine and other issues in the international arena over the last 9 months. You've seen it in terms of how, for example, he's engaged in the levying of tariffs across the globe. So it's not clear what he would do in order to force the Russians into a different position. He says that there'd be pressure brought to bear. What does that mean? We frankly don't know. And he can change his mind. And he has done this a number of times before. But the framing, again, is just very problematic. You're going to talk Ukraine without having the Ukrainians there. That's not really going to empower the Ukrainian position at the negotiating table. And it does empower the Russians.
If no ceasefire is agreed to, what might happen next in terms of the trajectory of the war over the next year?
So the Ukrainians are going to keep on fighting. They need to have support from not only the European allies, but from their American allies. And having this sort of open division between NATO allies in Europe and NATO allies in North America, I think doesn't really help matters. I think it makes it clear to the Russians that Ukraine doesn't have full backing from the rest of Europe and the rest of the West more generally, and that's not going to really help bring this war to a close. On the contrary, I think it will encourage the Russians to take more territory in Ukraine, even if with just the intention of them bargaining in some way to hold the territory that they really want to have at the moment in eastern Ukraine. But keeping in mind, this isn't a situation where the Russians invaded Ukraine and the Ukrainians invaded Russia and that they have territory on both sides to exchange or something. This is a war of aggression. It is a war where Russia invaded Ukraine and is occupying Ukrainian territory. And irrespective of how one feels about Ukraine, the precedent it sets, where you can have this power from Moscow simply invade and occupy, is a very bad precedent indeed when it comes to Europe. I should say that much of the global South sees this and thinks, well, actually, the West has allowed this to happen in places like Palestine or invasions and occupation in Iraq. So the rules-based order was already in question. But this certainly doesn't help things. This, I think, makes the fragmentation of the rules-based order even more.
The two sides, Ukraine and Russia, very far apart. We are where we are now. How realistic is land swapping? Is that ever going to be part of any peace deal for Russia and Ukraine? None.
No, there can't be land swap because Ukraine does not occupy any Russian territory. It's not about land swap. According to international law, the Russians must simply leave Ukrainian territory. It's not that if Russia leaves Ukrainian territory and the Ukrainians will leave Russian territory. There is no Russian territory that has been invaded and occupied. So the question is, frankly, speaking as a European, the question is, are we going to allow for an imperial power such as Russia to simply invade a country, occupy territory, and threaten to occupy more territory? And what does this say in terms of reliability of the United States as a security partner? Because, of course, the Ukrainians were relying very much on the United States, and much of Europe continues to do so, while recognizing that this isn't necessarily a long-term solution. So I think that's the broader framing question here. It's not two sides at war against each other. It's one side has actually invaded the other.
Yeah, appreciate that so much. Thank you, Dr. H A Hellyer. He is from the Royal United Services Institute for Defence. Thank you again.